welcome to Fiber Friday. My name's Julie and I'm a blogger over at Julie Measures. Today we're going to work on a knit craft. So I've got this free pattern for a quilted lattice knit mason jar cozy. It's over on my website, Julie Measures. I rebranded, so that was the old name. But the new website is Julie Measures. And you can go over and search for the pattern, and there's a link in the video description and you can go grab that. And this is a knit pattern, and we're going to do something that we haven't really done before with knitting here, and that is play a little bit with knitting in the round. And you can do that two different ways. You can use double pointed needles, so there's a set of 4 double pointed needles, or you can find, if you can find a really small round cable needle, and you can knit in the round. So this is a really short cable needle. So for this pattern, it has the materials listed on the pattern if you go grab it and print it out. But I'm using a medium weight yarn. And then the pattern actually calls for smaller needles that I'm playing with today, but around a 4mm needle. You can play with your gauge to see what fits, and you just want it to fit as a little cozy on your mason jar. Just a little way to dress up your mason jar. Make it a little more cozy because I like to put yarn on everything. Today I'm going to show you on this set of 4 double pointed needles, and then I've just got some standard craft store medium weight, also called worsted weight or an Aran weight wool or yarn. So I've got just some acrylic today. Since I'm doing this cozy, I wanted it to be, I don't know, easily washable. One little caveat, I do knit, it's called the continental style. So I am right-handed, but I hold the working yarn in my left hand. If you are a novice knitter, if you've done some crocheting and you want to learn to knit, it's actually the way I recommend. I think it's easier. The pattern, I've got my needles, and I've got the yarn. I said I've never demonstrated casting on 2 double point needles before, so we'll do that real quick. I'm probably just going to use a long tail cast on. There are other cast on videos on my YouTube channel for different cast on methods. There's a whole slew of different ways to cast on. So if you don't like one way, there's dozens and dozens of ways to cast on. Long tail was the first that I learned, and it just is still the fastest for me. So the pattern says to cast on 40. So I'm going to kind of I'll shrink the pattern a little bit just to demo it, but we will cast on 40. 2. And when you're doing double points, cast on probably like more. So you're going to be knitting in the round. Okay, so eventually I'm going to split all the stitches between 3 of the needles, and then 1 of the needles is my working needle. But I'm going to cast on, you know, a lot on this, and then I'm just going to kind of slide them where I need them to be. So, for example, there's kind of a bunch here, so I'm going to go ahead and move a few over to another needle. So I'm just slipping the stitches from one needle to the other. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And obviously if I'm casting on 40 stitches, I can't really that doesn't evenly divide among 3 needles, but I'm going to do, you know, pretty even numbers between the different needles. you start knitting in the round, the most important thing is to not twist the stitches. So to start with, no, I pulled way too much out for that tail, but I didn't want to be short. So, okay. So you want all the stitches in the middle pointing inwards, and then I can make sure that none of them are twisted. Can you see that? So that's going to be my circle. So this is the last stitch I cast on. This was the first stitch I cast on. And when I knit them together, then I'll be in the round. And you do the knitting with this other needle. So double pointed needles come in sets of 4 or 5. I tend to use them in a set of 4, even if I have a 5th, and just do the 3, and then I've got this other, my working one. So I know that looks a little crazy and a little intimidating perhaps. The first time that you do double pointed needles, it's gonna feel like you're holding all the things, but it gets easier. And I love knitting in the round because instead, you know, if I was knitting this flat and I wanted to make something round, I'd have to stitch it up. And this way, there's no stitching at the end. So it's less finishing work, so that when I'm done knitting, I'm just done. So the first few rounds of this pattern are ribbing, which is a set of alternating knit and purl stitches. So a lot of times, like sweaters, you know, they'll have ribbing. So this just has ribbing that's along the top. And it's just a pattern of knit 2, purl 2, ribbing, repeated around. Went all the way around with our ribbing, our knit and purl stitches. Okay, so you would do that for 4 rounds, and then in the 5th round, we're going to increase to 42 stitches. So I would knit 20, and then increase 1, knit 20, increase 1. And you don't have to do it in that order, just, you know, around, as you're going around at 2 points, increase. There are lots of ways to increase. I'm going to show you one today. So I don't like to do it like, I don't know, at the join right there between the needles. I'd rather do it in the middle. I don't know why. But you can just lift that bar between the stitches. Actually, I want it to go that way. And then knit into it. And that's one way to create a stitch and increase your stitches. I like that method because it doesn't really leave a hole. Sometimes, depending on what you're knitting, especially if it's lace, you want there to be a visible hole because that's what you're going for. But that make one by lifting the bar up between stitches, if I want the increase to not be seen, is one of my favorite. So there's this bar right here between the stitches, and I just lift it up and then knit into it. Just like that. And that is one way to make an increase. Another way is just to add on a wrap stitch, and that would add a stitch. But I feel like that leaves a hole, a more noticeable hole, so I like the other method better, at least for this pattern. Okay, so I would go around, that would be row 5 if we had done all the ribbing rounds that the pattern calls for. And that's the increase round. Okay, round 6 is another round where you knit all the way around, so I don't feel like we need to demonstrate that. And then starting with row 7, actually 6 through 13, when you get to that point, that's the bulk of the pattern. You repeat those rows or rounds until the cozy is the height that you want it. So you can make it, you know, if you've got a shorter jar, you don't have to repeat as many times. If you have a taller jar, you can repeat more, and you can just make it fit for what you're making. But you do those, that round 6 through 13, and then you repeat it to the height needed. And then you decrease, which makes the bottom. So this is, we're knitting from the top down. So the ribbed rows are on top, and that's at the top of the jar. Then you do these repeats to get the height that you need, and then you do the decreases that form the bottom. And that makes the cozy. So round 6 is just knitting around. Then round 7 is how we start making the lattice shape that you'll be able to see on the website in the finished pictures. And that is done mostly by some slip stitches. So let's do those. So round 7 is we're going to start by slipping 5 stitches with the yarn in front. So with the yarn in front, I'm going to slip 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that gets the yarn across in front. Then I knit 1 stitch, and then I repeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I knit 1. So just like that, I'm just making a line in front. We're doing multiples of 6. So slipping 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as you're slipping, make sure not to pull this too tight so that these don't end up bunched up. Make sure you're that this is loose enough as you're going. Okay, then I knit 1. I need my yarn in front so I can slip. And I wasn't counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then knit. And because I added those stitches, I don't have that 12 that I started with. So I've got 1 over here, and I don't know, like it, my patterns to all kind of be on a needle together. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Make sure I've got hold enough space, and then knit. And so I'm also trying not to knit too tightly to give that some space. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this yarn that we're holding in front is how we're going to get that lattice look. right, and then I've got one more group, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I know if this didn't line up, then I've miscounted somewhere, because I have 42 stitches, and I'm doing groups of 6. So there's a little bit of math involved with knitting when you're doing multiples of things. All right, so that was round 7. Round 8 is another round where I'm just going to knit around, and I am going to do that so that we can get the right height to show you for this lattice rounds. So just knit in every stitch. This pattern is primarily knit stitches. Some people have a preference whether they prefer knit or purl stitches. If you like knit stitches, you get to do a lot in this pattern. I like knitting in the round too because of that. I knit faster than I purl. And typically the knit stitch is what we think of as the right side of something, like on a sweater or other item. A hat, that's the side we look at. So you're always looking at the side of the piece that is going to be your finished side. So this is round 8. I'm knitting around. I said the actual pattern would be taller by this point because we'd have those 4 full rounds of rib stitches. Okay, so back to the beginning. This tail here is a good way to know you've gone around. If you're using circular needles, you could also you would use a stitch marker, which maybe I have one right here. I just saw one on my desk, but oh yeah, like this. You just slip that onto the needle and it marks the round, so you know where you're starting and stopping. Okay, I'm here. So that was round 8. So round 9, I'm going to knit 2. Then I'm going to insert the right needle under the loose strand, and I'm going to knit into this stitch, bringing it kind of under both. So basically I'm knitting into the next stitch and I'm lifting up that strand so that it makes a point. And then I am knitting 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's the last 2 stitches, the knit stitch, the next 2 stitches, and that brings me to the midpoint of that section where we slipped those 5. So basically in the middle of that slip 5 section, I'm putting my needle under that loose strand, then I'm inserting it just like I'm going to knit. I'm grabbing that knit stitch and I'm pulling it all the way under that loose strand and then taking it off. And that lifts that loose strand up to make that point. And then I'm going to knit over again to the next midpoint. And repeat that. So under the loose strand, through the stitch, yarn over, pull through, and take it off. And you just repeat that all the way around for round 9. So the midpoint of every slip stitch section, if you don't want to have to count, is where I'm, sorry. Sometimes I get busy looking at my yarn and don't notice that I'm going off the screen, so apologize for that. Okay, we're almost back to the start. And there's the mid one. So I lift up and knit through. And sometimes I get questions about my knitting style, the way I hold my needles. This is the continental method, where you hold the working yarn in your left hand. I am right-handed. I learned to crochet before I learned to knit. And I've been told since then that a lot of people who crochet first also find it easier to knit this way. But in some of my videos you'll see you can certainly hold the needle in your right hand if that's more comfortable for you. But there are two ways to hold the needle, so if you've only tried one way, try the other way, because you might like it. Okay, round 10, we're just knitting in every stitch. So I told you, this pattern looks all fancy because of the way the lattice looks with those stitches in front, but it's really just a lot of knit stitches. So don't be intimidated. The biggest thing that you're going to do on this pattern really is just the double pointed needles. So, because we're already to round 10 on our section where we're repeating, and in round 11 we're just kind of, it's very similar to round 5 where you're going to slip some stitches. You're just going to slip them in a different place so that they so that the peaks, so that it makes the design that we want. So knitting and slipping and just a little bit of purling there at the start where we did the rib stitches. So that about covers all the techniques that you'll need for this pattern. Really the last thing in the decrease rounds, if you've never decreased, is that you'll be knitting some stitches together. So instead of knitting one stitch at a time, when you decrease, the pattern calls in a lot of areas to knit 2 stitches together, which is just like that. You insert the needle through 2, wrap it around, and pull it through. And that's pretty much everything you need to know how to make the quilted lattice knit mason jar cozy.